On the 2nd of May, 1945, a lone figure descended a mountain road in the Tyrolean Alps. Magnus von Braun, younger brother of the man who built the V2, had tied a white handkerchief to his bicycle handlebars and was pedaling toward American lines near Reuth, Austria. When soldiers from the 44th Infantry Division stopped him, he said, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender." Waiting further up the mountain, Wernher von Braun had a plaster cast covering his left arm and shoulder, the result of a complicated fracture sustained in March when his driver fell asleep at the wheel. Around him stood SS guards carrying standing orders from General Hans Kammler. Should Allied forces close in, the entire Peenemünde rocket team was to be executed before they could be taken alive. Kammler had moved roughly 450 Peenemünde specialists to Oberammergau in the Bavarian Alps in early April, ostensibly for their protection. In reality, the order was designed to keep them from surrendering intact. The scientists had anticipated this. Weeks earlier, they had concealed 14 tons of V2 technical documents deep inside a mine shaft near Bleikerode, preserving what they knew the Americans would want most. The U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps recovered the cache by the 15th of May, 1945, reportedly just as British forces were establishing roadblocks in what would become their occupation zone. Von Braun was now in American custody, an SS Sturmbannführer, the rank of a major and the most valuable rocket engineer alive. The men who debriefed him had walked weeks earlier through the underground factory where his rockets were built. They had seen what was left behind. In 1937, the German army established its most ambitious research facility on the Baltic island of Usedom, at a place called Peenemünde. It became the world's most advanced rocket development center. A young engineer named Wernher von Braun, barely 25, was appointed technical director, charged with turning experimental rocketry into a weapon that could alter the course of the war. The rocket they built was designated the A4, rechristened by Nazi propagandists as the Vergeltungswaffenway, Vengeance Weapon 2. 14 meters tall and weighing 12,500 kilograms, fully fueled, it burned ethanol and liquid oxygen to hurl a 1,000-kilogram warhead across hundreds of kilometers. It arrived at speeds exceeding 5,000 kilometers per hour. No defense existed against it. On the 20th of June, 1944, a test launch from Peenemünde crossed the Kármán line at 176 kilometers altitude, making it the first artificial object in history to reach space. The weapon went operational that September 8th, targeting London and Antwerp. By the war's end, 3,172 V2s had struck Allied cities. Von Braun joined the Nazi Party in November of 1937. In the spring of 1940, he entered the SS as a second lieutenant, and by June of 1943, Heinrich Himmler had promoted him to Sturmbannführer, the rank of major. Von Braun's own account held that his army superior, Colonel Walter Dornberger, had effectively compelled him toward SS membership to protect the rocket program's standing within the Reich. Some historians accept this framing, others have not. Michael Neufeld of the National Air and Space Museum concluded the record appears, in every case, to reflect external pressure, while stopping deliberately short of full exculpation. On the 28th of August 1943, the SS established a new subcamp of Buchenwald in the hills near Nordhausen in central Germany. It was called Mittelbau Dora. On the 1st of November 1944, it became an independent concentration camp. Over the course of its operation, approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through its gates, conscripted to hollow out a mountain. In the earliest months, prisoners never left the tunnel system. They slept on 4-level wooden bunks wedged into carved alcoves along the walls, ate and relieved themselves beside barrel latrines, and never once saw daylight. The air was thick with blasting dust and exhaust fumes. An estimated 6,000 prisoners died in the first 6 months of tunnel construction alone, before a single rocket had come off the line. V2 rocket production began in January 1944. Monthly output climbed to 400 units by May, then 600 by September, a pace sustained through February 1945. Approximately 5,789 rockets were assembled in total. Wernher von Braun made documented visits on January 25th and again on the 6th of May. On the second visit, he discussed securing additional enslaved French workers. He later called the conditions repulsive and kept returning. By the time American forces arrived in April 1945, approximately 20,000 prisoners had died at Mittelbau Dora, roughly 1 in every 3 who passed through. Around 350 were publicly hanged, 200 specifically for sabotage. In the final weeks, executions reached 30 to 50 per day. The V2 killed an estimated 9,000 people across London, Antwerp, and other cities. More people died building the weapon than were ever killed by it. In April 1945, American forces drove hard toward the Harz Mountains, racing a calendar as much as an enemy. The middlework lay inside territory already designated for the Soviet occupation zone under the Yalta agreements. Army units worked fast, pulling an estimated 100 complete or near-complete V2 rockets from the tunnels, and loading them onto rail wagons bound for 16 Liberty ships waiting on the Atlantic coast. The hardware was only part of the prize. Von Braun's team had hidden 14 tons of V2 technical documents, blueprints, and test records in a mine shaft near the town of Bleicherode, sealed against discovery. American intelligence officers located the cache and extracted it within days, reportedly completing the operation just as British forces were establishing their sector boundary nearby. Documents were irreplaceable, and both sides understood that. The Soviets occupied Peenemünde and Nordhausen within weeks of the American withdrawal. The key engineers had already moved west, choosing their captors with care. Moscow's answer came 16 months later. On October 22, 1946, Soviet security forces moved simultaneously across the occupation zone, rounding up approximately 2,500 German rocket specialists and their families before dawn and transporting them east to continue work on Soviet soil. As the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, von Braun and his closest engineers faced a single decision: whom to surrender to. For von Braun, the choice was not a difficult one. The Soviets offered nothing he wanted. Britain and France lacked the means to fund rocketry on the scale he imagined. Only the United States had both the money and the ambition. In early May, his team came down from the Bavarian Alps and gave themselves up to American troops. On the 20th of July, 1945, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff formally established Operation Overcast, a program to secure Germany's scientific talent before the Soviet Union could claim it. By November, the code name had leaked into the Bavarian communities where candidates were housed, forcing a rename. Ordnance Corps officers had taken to clipping paperclips onto the folders of their preferred recruits. The name stuck. President Truman's directive on the matter was explicit. No member of the Nazi Party, no active supporter of Nazism or militarism would be admitted to the United States. It was a standard that, applied honestly, would have disqualified the overwhelming majority of the more than 1,600 scientists, engineers, and technicians eventually brought over in a program that ran formally until 1959. Werner von Braun, SS officer and party member, would not have made it through the door. There was an obstacle. Many of these men had been members of the Nazi Party, and some had belonged to the SS. President Truman's own directive barred committed Nazis from entering the country. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency found a way around it. It rewrote their security files, scrubbing the most damning details from the record, so that men once deemed a security threat could be cleared for American laboratories. Armed with these sanitized dossiers, the candidates moved through State Department immigration reviews without obstruction. Security clearances were granted. Visas and employment contracts followed, the same approvals that would have been flatly refused had the actual records been placed on the desk. Not everyone accepted this without protest. Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Rabbi Stephen S. Wise raised public objections when limited details of the program became known. The Cold War, however, had already provided its answer. By February 1946, approximately 127 German specialists had assembled at Fort Bliss, Texas, confined to a 6-acre ordnance area and barred from leaving without an escort. Across the state line, at White Sands Proving Ground, assembly began on captured V2 hardware. The first successful launch came on the 10th of May, 1946, the rocket reaching 70 miles altitude. In 1946, a V2 carried a 35mm motion picture camera to 105 kilometers above the Earth. The film canister, recovered from the desert floor, held the first photographs of our planet ever taken from space. Beginning that December, family members started arriving from Germany. Wives and children brought over through the following summer as a deliberate measure to anchor the scientists in their new country. Between April 1946 and September 1952, 73 V2 launches took place at White Sands, with the German team at the center of every flight. The most notorious came on the 29th of May 1947, when a Hermes test rocket left the range with its guidance wired backwards and veered south across the Mexican border. It crossed Fort Bliss and El Paso before striking Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, roughly 1.5 miles from Buena Vista Airport, digging a crater 50 feet wide and 24 feet deep. No one was killed. What emerged afterwards was more troubling. During the flight, a project scientist had physically restrained the range safety officer from activating the self-destruct, the German team's sense of ownership over these rockets apparently superseding basic safety protocols. Rocketry was not the only discipline America sought to import. Hubertus Strughold had run aeromedical research for Hermann Goering's Air Ministry, studying how human bodies withstood the extremes of high-altitude flight. When he arrived in the United States in August 1947, his wartime record had been quietly smoothed over. He went on to help design life support systems for Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, earning the title Father of Space Medicine. October 1942, Strughold attended a conference in Nuremberg, where SS physician Sigmund Rascher presented results drawn from experiments on Dachau prisoners. The subjects had been immersed in freezing water, confined in pressure chambers simulating extreme altitude, and in some cases, operated on without anesthetic. Several of Strughold's former colleagues were later convicted at the 1947 Nuremberg doctors' trial. Strughold himself faced Nuremberg doctors' trial. Kurt Bröhm's case presented the logic of Paperclip in its starkest form. As the Third Reich's Deputy Surgeon General, he had directed its biological warfare program. He was charged at the Nuremberg doctors' trial with conducting lethal experiments on prisoners, and he was acquitted. The United States Army Chemical Corps then recruited him, apparently judging the acquittal sufficient clearance for employment in a program designed to study precisely that category of weapons. Walter Schreiber, a Wehrmacht Major General who oversaw military medical operations including human experimentation, arrived in the United States under Air Force sponsorship in 1951. The following year, the Boston Globe published an investigation into his wartime record. A survivor publicly identified him. The JIOA's response was to arrange his immigration to Argentina in 1952, removing him from scrutiny rather than referring the matter to any prosecutor. Between 1945 and 1952, the United States Air Force alone brought over 260 Paperclip scientists into the country, drawn from aviation medicine, chemical and biological weapons research, aerodynamics, and submarine technology. Across every field and every program, the outcome was the same. No Paperclip recruit was ever prosecuted in the United States for wartime conduct. In 1950, as the Korean War drew American attention back toward the threat of large-scale conflict, the Army moved von Braun's team from the Texas desert to Redstone Arsenal, a sprawling military installation on the Tennessee River outside Huntsville, Alabama. The city was then a quiet market town of 30,000 people. It would not remain quiet for long. Huntsville became von Braun's home and headquarters for the next 20 years. On February 1, 1956, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency was formally established at Redstone Arsenal, with Major General John B. Madaris in command and von Braun as technical director. The team's signature design had already proven itself. The PGM-11 Redstone, direct V2 descendant using the same propellant combination, first flew on August 20, 1953. Declared operational by 1955, it became America's first field, deployed nuclear-capable ballistic. Vindication came on January 31, 1958, when a modified Redstone called the Jupiter C lifted Explorer 1 into orbit 4 months after the Soviet Sputnik had shaken Washington and the watching world. Across America, millions watched the launch broadcast live on television. 3 years later, a Redstone rocket carried astronaut Alan Shepard on America's first human spaceflight. Overseeing the Redstone's development throughout was Arthur Rudolph, who served as technical director of the missile project at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. At Middlework, Rudolph had been operations director of V2 production, managing a factory sustained by concentration camp slave labor from the Dora tunnels. In August 1963, he was named project director of the Saturn V rocket. The men who had run those tunnels now ran America's journey to the moon. On the 1st of July 1960, NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center opened in Huntsville, Alabama, with Wernher von Braun installed as founding director. He would hold that role for nearly a decade, stepping down on the 27th of January 1970. The team he assembled around him was, in many respects, the same team he had led at Peenemünde. The ambition had not changed. Only the flag above the building was different. What emerged from Marshall's engineering halls was the Saturn V, a machine of staggering scale. 363 feet tall, it weighed 6.2 million pounds at launch. Its first stage carried 5 engines, generating 7.5 million pounds of thrust, the most powerful rocket ever to leave the ground. Between 1967 and 1973, it flew 13 times without a single failure. On the 16th of July, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted from Kennedy Space Center on a column of fire heard 50 miles away. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin touched down on the lunar surface on the 20th, while Michael Collins kept orbit overhead, and all 3 returned safely on the 24th. The program's own director said publicly that without Wernher von Braun, America would not have reached the moon. Standing beside von Braun was Kurt Debus, director of Kennedy Space Center from 1960 to 1974. Former member of both the Nazi Party and the SS, Debus had worked with von Braun at Peenemünde and now oversaw every Apollo launch. Arthur Rudolph, who had run operations at the Mittelwerk, became the man in charge of building the Saturn V and later received NASA's highest civilian honor. In 1979, a Justice Department attorney named Eli Rosenbaum encountered Arthur Rudolph's name in a published account of wartime forced labor. The investigation led to the National Archives, where the original records told a story the immigration files never had. As operations director at Mittelwerk, Rudolph had held direct authority over a workforce of concentration camp prisoners worked to death in the tunnels below Könstein. Von Braun escaped this accounting by dying first. He died of pancreatic cancer on June 16, 1977, in Alexandria, Virginia, at 65, before the OSI had opened its paperclip files. President Carter mourned him as an American whose achievements in space had benefited all the people of the world. The slave labor behind his rockets went unmentioned. In November 1983, Rudolph met with OSI investigators and signed an agreement to renounce his United States citizenship. He left for West Germany in March 1984, surrendering the Distinguished Service Medal NASA had given him in 1969. German authorities examined the evidence and declined to prosecute. Rudolph died in Hamburg on January 1, 1996, with no criminal conviction in either country. The OSI opened files on more than 70 paperclip scientists, though Rudolph remained the only one compelled to leave. The Aerospace Medical Association had for 50 years presented its annual Hubertus Strughold Award, founded in 1963. In 2013, renewed scrutiny of Strughold's attendance at a 1942 Nuremberg conference, where Dachau experimental data was presented, led the association to retire it. Strughold had died in 1986. The Rudolph case drew its own disputes. Some veterans of the space program argued he had been coerced rather than justly removed, that the program's achievements should outweigh what had been done in the tunnels. That argument found no legal resolution, nor a moral one. Celebration and complicity had been braided into the same program from the start, and no investigation was going to separate them. The arithmetic is not complicated. Approximately 20,000 prisoners died inside the tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora building these weapons. When the finished rockets fell on London and Antwerp, they killed an estimated 9,000 people. The V2 may be the only weapon system in history to have killed more in its manufacture than in its use. The men who built that manufacturing system then built the American space program. More than 1,600 German scientists and technicians were brought to the United States. Their combined intellectual output was later valued at roughly $10 billion in patents and industrial processes. Truman's explicit order barring Nazi Party members from immigration was not a policy that failed. It was a policy deliberately subverted, dossier, by officials who understood the law, understood the men, and decided the knowledge was worth more than the rule. Not one paperclip scientist was ever prosecuted in the United States for any wartime conduct. Arthur Rudolph, who had run operations at Dora, came closest. He never faced a court. In 1984, confronted with the evidence investigators had assembled, he renounced his citizenship and left for West Germany, where he died of old age in 1996. The Saturn V flew 13 times and never failed. It remains the most powerful rocket ever to fly. The moon landings it carried stand among the most extraordinary things any human civilization has attempted, let alone achieved. That is not diminished by asking who built the rocket or what it cost to bring those men to America. The achievement is real. So is the transaction that made it possible. Operation Paperclip remained classified for decades. The men were given awards, honored at ceremonies, celebrated in newspapers. The reckoning came slowly, in archives opened long after the fact, in the work of prosecutors who found one man willing to leave quietly rather than face public scrutiny, in the gradual emergence of a history the program had been designed to conceal. The rockets had already flown. That was this story, here on Errata. If you enjoy forgotten history, told accuracy first, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like, and we will keep bringing the past back to light.